In this video, we're going to be discussing Rabbi Levi Yitzchok Schneerson, the father of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Let's start off with his lineage. His father was Rabbi Baruch Schneerson, and his father was Levi Yitzchok Schneerson, and his father was Baruch Shalom Schneerson, who was the oldest son of the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, who we discussed in a previous video. They had a tradition that the Rebbe would, the Rebbe of Lubavitch would once again come back to their family, which again was fulfilled with Rabbi Levi Yitzchok's oldest son, the Rebbe, as we discussed in that previous video. His father, Rabash, as he was known, Rabbi Baruch Schneer, he was an interesting character in and of itself. He actually wrote a lot of, he had a diary that he kept about his experiences in Lubavitch as a chassid of the Rebbe Rashab and the Rebbe Maharash. And and those have since been published. So that's interesting biography, as well as his family. And you can see in his, he discusses his son and his grandson, the Rebbe, and his experience and his discussions about them with the Rebbe Rashab and of Lubavitch. And he took on the name. It seems that his birth name was not Baruch Schneer because his grandfather's name was Baruch Shalom, but rather it seems that when he got married, he took the name Baruch because his father-in-law's name was Schneer Zalman, so his name was Schneer Zalman, and he took the name Baruch after his grandfather had passed away, as a sign of the custom is not to have the same name as one's father-in-law, because then you're going to cause your wife to use her father's name. So if you have the exact same name, the custom is to add a name. So he added the name Baruch, so he became known as Baruch Schneer, and probably it was connected to the fact that that was his grandfather's name, so he took it on, but obviously that was after he had passed away, as is the Ashkenazi custom. He was a big chassid, Rabbi Levi Yitzchok now we're talking about. He was a big chassid of the Rebbe Rashab. It's not clear if he ever went to any formal yeshiva education, but he definitely was around. He definitely was around. He was born in 1878, so he was definitely, a young man when the Rebbe Rashab became the Rebbe in 1880. After the Rebbe Maharash would have passed away in 1883, he would have been very young. So definitely, he was a chassid of the Rebbe Rashab, and he definitely hung around Lubavitch. He learned in Lubavitch. He listened to Hasidic discourses of the Rebbe Rashab, and he was a dedicated chassid of his. His style of Torah was to find the Kabbalistic ideas of everything. And just as an example, one time when the Rebbe Rashab would said a Hasidic discourse, and he asked a few questions as he started his discourse, and Rabbi Levi Yitzchok later explained, based on Kabbalistic teachings, why he picked the order of those questions when he explained these Hasidic ideas. So these were, this was kind of his style of learning. It is said that he got this training in Kabbalah and Kabbalah from the Rebbe Rashab, and the Rebbe Rashab considered him a student in Kabbalah. As we discussed previously we talked about the Rebbe, after he got married to Rebbetzin Chana, her maiden name was Yanovsky. Actually, interestingly, his brother married Rebbetzin Chana's sister, so he had two brothers marrying two sisters, and he moved into his in-laws' home in Nikolaev, and that's where their first, I believe, at least two children, maybe even all three of their children, I think, were born in Nikolaev. In this city in Russia, where her father was the Rav, was the rabbi. And once in 1909, once the Rebbe was already a little boy, he became the Rav of Yekaterinoslav. Now, how did this come about? The previous rabbi of Yekaterinoslav had passed away, if I'm not mistaken, and therefore they were looking for a rabbi, and the Hasidim really wanted a Hasidic rabbi to be the chief rabbi of the city. And in order to do that, the Rebbe Rashab said that he wanted his student, Rabbi Levi Yitzchok Schneerson, and his cousin to be the next Rabbi Yekaterinoslav. And he sent his. It took a few years for this to come about, and it took. He asked Rabbi Levi Yitzchok to acquire a number of smichos, of ordinations, in order to be qualified to be the rabbi. Now, he specifically asked that since he was going to be the rabbi for the entire community, and therefore he had to not just be the rabbi of the Hasidim, but he had to be the rabbi of the whole community, and he had to kind of win everybody over. He said, why don't you go to some of the big leaders of the quote-unquote non-Hasidic community and ask them to give you smicha. And that way, when you show up, you'll say, look, I don't have just smicha from rabbis who who are from Hasidim, who are just like, hey, let's just push our Hasidic rabbi in. I'm very qualified, and you have smicha from a number of people. So one of the people that he told him to go to was Rabbi Chaim of Brisk, the famous Brisk Rav, and he Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik, and Rabbi Levi Yitzchok didn't really want. He said, he's going to give me a hard time because I'm a Hasidic rabbi who likes to teach Kabbalah a lot. This guy is going to give me a very hard time. He said, don't worry, you'll be just fine. So apparently one of the stories that came out from that visit, was that Rabbi Chaim of Brisk was sitting on They were sitting on Sukkos, and the way part of this smicha test would be not, when you're getting a smicha test, not just to be, get a paper, but in order to be a practical rabbi, you have to also have some training and see how you react in certain situations. So they were sitting on Sukkos, and they came to the Rabbi Chaim of Brisk, and they asked him a question, that on Sukkos they forgot to make an Eruv Chatzeres, which means an Eruv that connects to the entire apartment building, and therefore they're allowed to carry from the apartment building to the courtyard to the other apartments in the building, and therefore they're all considered like one home by making this eruv. Therefore, you could carry into the sukkah. In this case, they're worried about they had forgotten to make it before Yontif, and now it's ready Yontif. You can't make an eruv on Yontif. The question is, what do they do now? Are they allowed to bring their food into the sukkah or not? So they asked Rabbi Chaim of Brisk, and he right away turned to his student, who's he's rabbi in training, that he's asking for his ordination. So he said, "What do you think?" And Rabbi Levi Yitzchok answered that the sukkah itself is the eruv. The fact that they built a sukkah, and now they're all, as a community, they're all using one sukkah in this apartment building for the entire apartment building. That itself shows that it's an eruv, and therefore they have already a communal participation, and therefore they can carry their food into the sukkah and enjoy their Yontif meal. And Rabbi Chaim of Brisk was very impressed with this answer. So that's just a small anecdote. So he was obviously, Rabbi Levi Yitzchok was not just a great Kabbalist, but he was a great Torah scholar. The fact that he was able to eventually achieve getting smicha from Rabbi Chaim of Brisk. He even at a young age, he was very involved in communal work. The Rebbe Rashab had him very involved in the communal work at that time, including helping Jewish Russian soldiers in the Russian-Japanese War. We talked previously about getting matzahs and things like that. He was involved with that. He also was we talked about, he was the rabbi in Dnepropetrovsk, which later became Dnepropetrovsk once the communists took over. The Yekaterinoslav is named after Catherine the Great, so obviously the communists didn't like that. And so it later became known as Dnepropetrovsk, or we might use both names, so that's the reason why. When he became the rabbi, like we said, not everybody was necessarily thrilled about having a Hasidic rabbi be the chief rabbi. Nonetheless, eventually he won everybody over. He was very well liked, to the point when the communists took over, even the KGB agents that were assigned to harass him and eventually arrest him, even they took a liking to Rabbi Levi Yitzchok. He was very, very beloved, to the point where he was really arrested. He was not arrested until 1938, which, in the terms of the Jewish persecution by the communists, was much later in the game. Don't forget, the previous Rebbe was arrested in 1927, and throughout that time period in the 1920s, Hasidim were being arrested and being shot and exiled to Siberia. Somehow he avoided that, and part of the reason was that people refused to inform on him. Even when they had evidence against him, people would let them know and say, "Rabbi Levi Yitzchok, please don't sleep at home tonight. That is, you gotta, someone's coming in the middle of the night." So he obviously had a lot of, he really won everybody over. He had a tremendous bond with his community. In addition to that, there's stories of even KGB officers who wanted to get married according to Jewish law, and they would come to Rabbi Levi Yitzchok to officiate a chuppah. Again, these things were all illegal at that time in the USSR, and they would come to him, and he would do it without questions, and he had really without fear, which was something that he displayed throughout his life. He had zero fear of not just the communists, but anybody who was willing to go against him. You cannot intimidate this man. In addition to his communal work with the community in the we had Russian, Polish refugees coming from in World War One. Many of those people ended up in Yekaterinoslav, and Rabbi Levi Yitzchok and his wife Rabbi Simchana took care of them, and took care of them physically. Their home was like the refugee center, and they would come and they would say, "Okay, you need to go here for clothing, here for food, here for shelter." And Rabbi Simchana herself prepared food for these people. You had many famous rabbis who came through, and Rabbi Levi Yitzchok took care of them physically, spiritually, and in any way that they could. His style of love and reaching out to every single Jew came out a lot during the time when the communists took over. When the communists would they forced people to work on Shabbos, and because of that, it was in the Soviet Union, if a person didn't work on Shabbos, they would lose their job. Then they would lose any ability to get food, to keep an apartment, and it was a very, very difficult situation. And not everybody could withstand the test of not keeping Shabbos, and therefore Rabbi Levi Yitzchok decided on Yom Kippur he was going to make an early minyan, so that people could come, pray the entire Yom Kippur service, and then they could go to work on Yom Kippur. And he understood that this was a very difficult test for people. Not everybody was able to withstand it, and he felt that at least they should have an opportunity, that they should come to shul on Yom Kippur and pray even early in the morning. Now, the thing that he's most famous for, and probably the most persecuted for, was matzah. He wanted to make sure that there would be kosher matzah in Russia. Don't forget, Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe, and therefore a lot of matzah made in Ukraine will be shipped to the entire Soviet Union, and really probably all bread products. And he insisted on everything being the most kosher, and they threatened him. They said, we'll just make matzah, and you just put your stamp of approval on it. And he said, no, absolutely not. He came to the bakery, he would kasher the bakery, he would certify the flour, and they would send flour in a truck that or a train that he had not supervised. He would send it back, and he refused to take it. And he insisted on having only the most kosher matzah possible. And in fact, eventually he was arrested right before Pesach in 1938, just a couple days before Pesach. And when they asked him in the late 1990s, or early 1990s, they released the transcripts of his depositions, if you could call it that, interrogations. Once he was arrested, and they asked him, "How did you get this to happen?" So he said, "What do you mean? I went to the president of Russia, President Kalinin, not the premier, that was Stalin, but the president or the prime minister, whatever they would call it. They had all these puppets, all doing whatever Stalin wanted." And he said, "I bribed him." That's what he said in his deposition, in his interrogation. And in fact, we do know he did meet with Kalinin and somehow got permission. So whether or not he bribed him or not, now what are the KGB agents supposed to say when he says, "I bribed the president of Russia"? It was definitely an interesting answer. So let's take a step back before we get to his arrest and exile. His children. So obviously, his oldest son was the Rebbe, and in 1927 he left Russia with his father-in-law, the previous Rebbe, and eventually got married in 1929 in Poland. They pushed off the wedding until 1929, or really 1928, the winter of 1928, because they wanted that that his parents should be able to come to the wedding. When the Russians did not allow them an exit visa, they made the wedding without any choice over there. Sadly, the Rebbe never saw his father again once they left after that. After Simchas Torah, 1927, he never saw his father again. And in 1928, in the winter of 1928, when he got married, the Rabbi Levi Yitzchok and his wife Rebbe Chana made a wedding of their own. And at that time, the communists had actually seized all property, as is their custom, and they make everything communal and they give it away. So make sure that you don't think that it's still yours. So part of what they had done, they had this big apartment, and by Russian standards at that time, and they had given away half the apartment. They had given away to another family, another Russian non-Jewish family, and in honor of this wedding, this person who occupied the other half of their apartment actually moved out, took out all their furniture in order they could invite everybody to come. A lot of people, and hundreds of people came, and Rabbi Levi Yitzchok was so excited. The fact that his son was marrying the Rebbe's daughter was such a big simcha for him and the entire community, and they loved him so much that the entire community, notwithstanding the danger of associating with Rabbi Levi Yitzchok at that time, or in any Jewish activities at the time, showed up in order to celebrate this wedding. Now let's talk about his arrest. In 1938, as we mentioned, right before Pesach, he was arrested, and eventually he was tortured, he was interrogated, and eventually he was sentenced to 5 years of exile to the country of Chiale, or a city somewhere out in Asia, way out deep in Russia. In this place, so Rebbe Chana, his wife, eventually found out where he was and was trying to get him food, because he obviously would not eat anything that wasn't kosher. So he barely had any food, and she was always trying to find out where he was. Eventually, she found out that he was finally sentenced after a couple of years. Now, they did him a favor that they said the sentence goes retroactively back to his original arrest, so he was going to be released in 1944. Approximately 1943, 44 approximately, based on his arrest being in 1938, if I'm not mistaken. And at that time, again, this is already in the middle of World War II, and Russia's in the middle of that mess. And he was sentenced to this place, and Rebbe Chana decided that she was going to go help her husband. She understood that he was probably not doing well physically, and just someone should go and care for him. And she packed up her apartment best she could, and took a few suitcases and traveled for I think it took her a few days to get there, to this godforsaken place. And they didn't. It's not like when they put you in exile, they didn't give you lodgings, they didn't give you a place to live. They just kind of let you off the train, and you had to fend for yourself, and just kind of report once a week that you were still in that place. And there was somebody who actually went and helped Rabbi Levi Yitzchok in the few weeks before his wife came. But eventually they came and they found a place to live. It was like the porch of a shack. The place was so hot; it was full of mosquitoes and just terrible, terrible, terrible conditions. A very backwards place where they didn't have proper heating, they didn't have proper rows, they didn't have proper anything. And Rabbi Levi Yitzchok was at that time. Eventually, he ended up being diagnosed with some sort of cancer, and eventually what ended up taking his life not so long afterwards. But he was very, very physically weak. He had undergone tremendous beatings and punishment by the Soviets, and he was not in a good shape. However, the thing that he really wanted the most was his mind. He was a big rabbi, and he was a big Kabbalist, and he had no one to talk to. There were no Jewish people there. Once in a while, they found like another Jew, and they would invite them over to share the few crumbs of bread that they had, and he would have someone to talk to. But even then, the person didn't really understand what he was saying. He was talking deep Kabbalistic ideas. And so Rebbe Chana realized the only option was for him was to write. So she would go to town, and she would purchase, with whatever few dollars that they had, they would purchase ink and notepads. Additionally, she would actually get berries. She would collect berries in the field, and she would cook them and try to make ink. And that ink is those documents. Eventually, she took them out of Russia. You could see them today. They have these colorful green fluorescent colors and pinks and just whatever berries she could find, and she was able to make ink just so her husband should have ability to write. And he wrote as much as he could. He would write on the margins of the few books that he had. He had a Zohar, he had a Tanya, he had a Chumash, and he would write on the margins. And obviously, his writing was very, very condensed, as he didn't have a lot of space. And so we have, and eventually, she did take those out of Russia. So we'll see in a second. In 1944, after all this, he was finally officially released. However, he was extremely ill, and in that right before Pesach, they moved to Kazakhstan, and at that time there were a lot of refugees from the regular part of Russia, and they were running away from the Nazis who had invaded Russia in the 1940s during World War II. So in 1944, middle of the war, they were many Hasidim were now in Kazakhstan. And the city of Almaty, they have a small Hasidic community. They moved there, and they were able to help take care of Rabbi Levi Yitzchok in his final few months. And sadly, he passed away on the 20th day of Av that summer. He passed away and is buried in Almaty. And but those few months were for him a big relief. Physically, obviously, they had much better conditions, but also he was now had a community again. He was able to talk to them, and he tried to inspire them. And there's many stories about his time, the few months that he spent in Almaty. After his passing, Rebbe Chana realized that she had to get out of Russia. Now, at that time was World War II, was very difficult, but eventually the Hasidic community in 1946 or 47, the Soviet government said that anybody who was a resident of Poland could go back to Poland. People who are refugees from Poland could now return to their home country. So it started this whole thing where the Hasidim would make fake passports that they were Polish, or they would purchase passports and forge passports and add name to passports, however it worked in those times. And they would then go on these trains that were officially for refugees, but really were filled with Hasidim. Many Hasidim later were arrested because of this. But at any rate, they wanted to make sure that Rebbe Chana got on one of these trains, and she did get on one of those trains. And she ended up taking with her these precious writings of her husband, Rabbi Levi Yitzchok, and brought it to her son in New York, including also some holy articles that they had in as an inheritance from their from the Tzemach Tzedek. From I think they had a gartel and a shofar and other things like that that were possessions of the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, and she brought them to New York. So those were her precious belongings. And eventually, she moved to New York. In 1947, she was able to settle in New York, and the last 20 years of her life or so, she spent in the presence of her son. And for her, this was a tremendous amount of nachas that her son was able to. She saw her son become the Rebbe and lead the community, and she was an important part of that. And she actually also wrote a journal of her times of her life. And a lot of all these stories that we have about her husband and the difficulties that they went through, she wrote them down, and you could see how much they suffered in this time. And the Rebbe himself was at that time was living in Paris, was trying to send them money and food, whatever he could to try to help them and make them better. But he never really forgave himself for the fact that his parents were not able to leave Russia and were stuck behind, and he wasn't able to help them to the best of his abilities. There is also some interesting documents that show that they actually had opportunities to leave Russia potentially. Rabbi Levi Yitzchok was offered earlier. He was offered the rabbinate in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and as well as Boston in America. And it seems that he did not want to leave, number one, because he felt that if he would leave, he didn't feel he had the right to leave. There were so many people relying on him to provide authentic Judaism, and therefore he didn't feel like he had the right to leave. In addition, their middle son, Beryl, was not well. He was in some sort of hospitalized, some sort of institution over there, and they felt they could not abandon him. And that is actually what it says in his interrogation documents, that he said that the reason they didn't take the Boston offer was because even though I don't know if they actually got exit visas or they didn't, or if they applied or they didn't apply. But once they realized that their son, because of his illness, was not going to get a visa to America, they did not take that offer. So unfortunately, Beryl, as well as his grandmother Rachel, Rabbi Simchana's mother, were both murdered by the Nazis, Yimach Shemam, when they came through that part of Ukraine. In addition, the Rebbe actually spoke a lot about his father. Every year he would do he would make a farbrengen in honor of his father's yahrzeit. In addition, he published his father's teachings, and the only extant teachings are the ones that were written pretty much in exile. There's a few others, in addition to correspondence that the Rebbe had with his father, letters that his father wrote him. Those are extant, but most of his teachings and his writings were lost. They were either destroyed by the Nazis or confiscated by the communists, and are lost until this day. However, the Rebbe published his father's teachings after they came to America, and at that time, once he was already the Rebbe, he felt that he no longer had the supervision over the Hasidic teachings that were being published. So therefore, he would not sign his name as the publisher. They would publish it as under the title Oitzer HaChasidim, which means the committee of people in charge of publishing Hasidic teachings, essentially. But he did not. But he would not sign his name because he felt that once he was ready the Rebbe, he was too busy to supervise the publishing and editing himself. The only exception was, or one of the only exceptions was his father's teachings, that he himself would sign his name as the publisher of his father's teachings, and because this was his way of honoring his father. In addition, on Shabbos Farbrengens, when the Rebbe would speak, he would speak about his father's teachings and explain them, especially the fact that they were written cryptically, because he didn't have a lot of space to write on the margins of his books or the few notepads that he had. And Rabbi Levi Yitzchok, many Hasidim today carry his name. Many people named their children after him, and his legacy is that one of Mesiras Nefesh, of self-sacrifice, of being not afraid of people who want to destroy Judaism. And his teachings live on. People study them. People learn them. And this is something that was very important to the Rebbe, that his father's teachings be taught and learned, and therefore it's important to many Chabad Hasidim to study and learn his teachings. In addition, there's also a nigun, a song that is a Hakafas nigun that has its tradition going all the way back to the Alter Rebbe. That was one of Rabbi Levi Yitzchok's favorite nigun. It's called the nigun Hakafas, and that song is associated with him, and the Hasidim also sing that as well. In addition, many Hasidim every year on the 20th day of Av make a pilgrimage to his grave out in exile in Almaty. He was buried, not just he lived in exile, but he was buried in exile. And many Hasidim visit his grave as a testimony to his legacy living on among Chabad Hasidim. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any comments, something I could have said, should have said, you can put in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you, God willing, in the next video.